In the last decades, progress has been made to reduce global poverty, but climate change threatens this progress. By 2030, it could bring 100 million more people into poverty. But this can be avoided if we make wise policy choices now. Climate-related shocks are already an obstacle to eradicating poverty. Natural disasters, like floods, destroy assets and livelihoods, and the poor are disproportionately affected. After Hurricane Mitch in Honduras, poor people lost 30% of their assets, 3 times as much as those not living in poverty. Poor people have fewer resources and receive less support from family, community, the financial system and social safety nets, making it harder for them to prevent, cope and adapt. Climate change will worsen these shocks and poor people will suffer more. Floods will become more frequent, affecting slum dwellers. Droughts will become more intense, affecting poor farmers. The good news is that good development, which is rapid, inclusive, and adapts to climate change, can prevent most of these impacts until 2030. This would include more climate-resistant crops and agricultural practices to protect farmers, more flood protection to protect slum and coastal dwellers, universal healthcare and social safety nets that protect the poor people who are currently not covered. However, in the long run, if emissions are not reduced, climate change impacts will exceed our adaptation capacity. To keep the long-term impacts on poverty in check, emission reduction policies need to be implemented now. And they need to be designed to protect the poorest people and support the poorest countries.
Agriculture is the main economic source for poor countries, but is most easily affected by destructive weather events. And it's not just the weather event destruction themselves, but the adverse effects, like sea level rise and the introduction of outside invasive species. Destructive weather events affect poor communities more than developed ones. On average, 23 people die in developed countries, but 1,052 people die in underdeveloped countries as a result of destructive weather events. 90% of economic losses occur in underdeveloped countries. Poor countries contribute least to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but will be affected the most by its impacts. Economic growth is proportional to carbon dioxide emissions, meaning if poor countries become wealthier, they will contribute more to global carbon emissions. The Paris Accords wants wealthier countries to cut more emissions so that other countries have the opportunity to grow. However, improving climate change could actually have negative economic consequences on poor communities. Money used to invest in cleaner, more expensive energy sources could take away from spending that could be used to reduce poverty. Policymakers and scientists need to really weigh the consequences and benefits of the energy and money it will cost to alter carbon emissions to see how detrimental it will really be to developing countries. Other impacts of climate change to poor communities include health effects of the continuous carbon emissions mostly felt by underdeveloped countries, especially children, because they cannot pay for treatment. Also, clean water becomes harder to access, which can lead to more health effects. Another big one is sea level rise, which impacts the main population which lives close to the coast and its resources. Lastly, there's migration. As the resources and land become uninhabitable, people will migrate to somewhere else, which will cause the conflict in the places which they migrate. This can potentially cause more deaths worldwide, and this factor in itself will not directly cause war, but could lay the precursors for conflict. Climate change also has specific impacts to poor communities within the United States. The U.S. is said to lose 0.7% of gross domestic product for every 1 degree of Fahrenheit warming. Most of these impacts will affect southern and south Midwest counties. The sea level rise will affect the coastal ones. Rising temperatures will cause higher air conditioning costs, and drier conditions could affect agriculture and create Dust Bowl-like conditions. Northern counties could actually potentially benefit economically because the higher temperatures would inversely mean lower energy costs. Warming reduces death rates in the north but increases them in the south. A study relied on the EPA figures that the place of the value of individual life at $7.9 million after adjusting for inflation. Changes in energy and death rates explain the 5 to 10% increase in gross domestic product in the north compared to the high decrease in the south. But it is said that the economic productivity declines once the average temperatures in the country are more than 55 degrees Fahrenheit. There are more initiatives being taken to assess the financial aspects associated with climate change because they will cause a financial hardship in the future. Health risks need to be taken into account, which can include more deaths due to the heat, longer allergy seasons, worsened water supplies, and disease spread by bugs. It is our job as members of the developed world to combat climate change, not only for ourselves, but for people less fortunate and without the resources to help themselves. We have to fight to educate and induce change because without our voice, our planet has no one left to fight for it.